Okay, I'm going to show you a little technique now for water and terrains. And the main thing is, let's say you want to have water inside of a terrain or inside of a defined area of a terrain, which is higher than if you had an ocean or an infinite plane, and you don't want the water escaping from the outside of that terrain. You kind of want it inside of a boundary. Well, we're going to cover that right now. I'm just going to go ahead and load in standard terrain because it's a little bit quicker loading than a procedural. I'm going to go ahead and double click on that and go to our terrain editor. And now we can uh, sort of shape out what I'm going to be showing you and an example of where this will come in handy. So I'm going to up our softness and change our size and flow just a little bit. And I want to dig out sort of the inside of this terrain just so we have a sort of isolated area. And I am going to be pulling back up that section that you see on the bottom there that's been sort of flattened out, but you just want to get an idea of sort of the shape. What I want to do then is raise up sort of our sides here, and I'm going to make it sort of an irregular shape, which is kind of the point of this, and you'll see why once we get to that point. I'm just going to raise this up. Okay, and then I'm going to go back into the center and raise that up just a little bit. Okay, now we'll just take this terrain right here, and let's say we wanted to add water to just this inside here, and we don't want our infinite plane, which we would normally make water on, or our water plane, we don't want it to go through the terrain, kind of using this red bar right here as sort of an example of where the water line would be, but we don't want it outside of the terrain, we just want it on the inside. There's a couple ways of doing it. Of course, what we could do is add an object in here. Let's say we added a cylinder and just sort of squished it out a little. Well, the problem is that's still going to end up, for the most part, penetrating the edges of this terrain and kind of leaking out, and then you'll get sort of a weird look, especially if little bits of water jetting out the sides. So I'm going to show you a quick little method that you can use to create water inside of here, which is an irregular shape. And I can make it even more irregular if I wanted to by raising up this center just a little bit more and then digging out the outside so that way we really can't use a cylinder for this. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and just finish this off and click OK. Now the easiest way to do this, I'm gonna go ahead and just apply a texture to this really quick. Under landscapes, just select the grass and layers, will look pretty nice. And now what I want to do is actually copy and paste this terrain. And now you can see I have terrain 2 in there, and that's just because I already had a previous object I was working on before I started recording. But just pretty much pretend that's just the only terrain. But I'm going to hit Control C and Control V to copy and paste. So now we have a duplicate, and we'll want to rename this duplicate water. And before we do anything else, actually what we can do is go into the terrain editor for that by double-clicking on the water object, actually in our main camera view, or any of the other views, or just double-clicking inside of our layers panel. And what I want to do is first lower all the edges and define our shape. So what I want to do is I'm going to make this a very harsh brush. So I want to change our softness all the way down and pull it all the way down to 0 and up our flow. And I'm going to set it to dig. And now what I want to do is just define the area of our terrain or our water. And using our previous terrain as sort of a template for this, we can just go in and kind of figure out what's going to be inside of that mountain region and what's going to be outside of it. And we can just go in here and sort of pull that in. And now what we can do is actually go inside a little bit further, and we can just define that area. And that way it won't come out of that sort of irregular shape. Which is kind of idea of this, because if you have an irregular shape, this is the best way to do it. And now what I want to do is actually crop out the bottom just enough so we get that edge. And you really have two options here, whether or not you want to make this completely flat, which you could easily do, which would perfectly mimic a uh, flat infinite plane or water plane. But what we could also do is give it a little depth, but I don't think we really need to do that. So what I'm going to do is pull this down on our top view and clip that, so bringing down our maximum until it's pretty much flat. And we can go down quite far and just give it the illusion of an infinite plane. And click OK. And now if you notice, we're pretty much down on the bottom here. So what we want to do is just kind of raise that up until we get actually into our terrain. And I'm going to throw a water texture on there really quick. Just clicking on our little material adder, a little arrow. Go to liquids, and I'm just going to use the default water. And now in our main camera preview, we do see little bits of creeping out on the sides, but actually if we look at our preview render, we'll see that those are not really there. So there might be a little, it might be a little bit off when it comes to the actual OpenGL preview, but when you get to the actual preview render, you'll notice that it's not there. And as you can see, we have it sticking out along the side, but that's because it's being displayed as boxes and squares. And it's really rounded off, and it's rounded off about in the center of each one of these boxes around the edges. So this isn't our actual shape of the terrain. It just gives us an idea of what it's coming from. It's just coming from that area. So I can go ahead and just do a quick render of this, and I'll render this to screen, go to Final, and hit Render so we can really take a look and see how this shows up. And it looks quite nice. So we can have our little water in here and not worry about it coming out of the edges. So this way we don't have to use an infinite plane, and we don't lose any of our detail on the outside because we are defining that specific area. And this is probably one of the easiest ways to do it. There are, of course, other ways to do it. If you don't want to use the terrain editor, you could combine several objects together to define the area and then make it into a meta blob. And then just give that meta blob a surface. The only problem with that is the meta blobs will become rounded on the edges, and that might throw off sort of your reflections and your specularity. So this is probably the best way to do it, and it's fairly accurate because that way we can use sort of our old terrain as a template, or the actual terrain itself as a template to sort of carve out that water. And of course we could adjust depending on the scale of your terrain and water. We could bring down the water a little bit if we wanted to, and also make that a little more murky, because right now we can really see to the bottom of that terrain. If I go ahead and double click on the water, go to transparency, we can make that a little bit murkier, and click OK. And then we'll be able to see less and less the more we increase that murkiness. And the best thing to really watch when you're adjusting the murkiness is actually your sort of coastline, or what would be a coastline, because it gives you a good idea. But what I was talking about before with the depth, we'll go ahead and do that now. If I double click on this terrain and we bring our max back up, we can actually make a sort of a block water, or a block of water. And what I'm going to do is hit raise and actually raise up this terrain in the inside so that we have it completely flat, and that's so we don't have any of those little bumps in there, and that way we get a nice clean water surface on top. And I'm going to click OK, and now because we did that, we have to bring it down But as you notice, it gives us a different effect. And what that has to do is with the murkiness. We actually get a very murky looking water now. And I think it's a lot more accurate when you're using murkiness to do something like this, where you have sort of that three-dimensional block of water in there. Because now, if we bring it down to about 50 and click OK, we're about back where we were before. So that's a 30% change of where we were, which gives us more options because once we get too high, what's going to happen is the jumps between percentages is going to be a little bit too much, and it's going to be very hard to adjust that murkiness level without losing a lot of detail. So now we have the ability to really go in there and change that up a lot differently than we did before, and we end up with a dark blue in the center, and then we can sort of see what would be our coastline on the outside and sort of the water's edge. So this is a pretty neat little method you can do, and you can create this with a bunch of different terrains, or you can create one terrain with all different levels of water. And that way, what you can do is just create a clone for every single water or a little retention pond or lake or whatever you have, and just create a clone of that original terrain for that. And then you can just sculpt out each individual water block that's going to be on a different level. Because if we crop this and we tried to have it on different levels, it wouldn't really work out too well. And it'd be very hard to cut up that image and sort of bring that around or cut up that terrain. So this is probably one of the best ways to do it. Like I said, all you gotta do is just make a couple of clones if you're gonna do multiple water levels within the same terrain.